Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. We're letting people in. We're expecting a big turnout this morning. So we will take a minute and let everyone in and we'll get started. This webinar is being recorded and you'll have the opportunity to have the link to the webinar afterwards as well.
For the folks coming into the room, welcome. It'd be fun
Oh,
to see where you all are coming from. So don't mind maybe posting what city and state you're located in and where you're joining us from.
great. Well, let's go ahead and get started because we have a packed agenda today. My name is Joan Toth, and I'm the Executive Director of CHIPS. Absolutely delighted to welcome the folks from Docsum AI here this morning. Uh, AI is just absolutely, as we all know, the hottest topic in tech these days. And I speak for myself, but hopefully many others when I say that, every week we're learning something new and there are advances and changes every week in AI. And
Wow.
so this, could you all mute yourselves, please? This webinar is coming to you from our Accelerators series, which is a series of sponsored webinars. And we are delighted to welcome Docsum AI this morning. And I'm going to turn it over to Shanak Taraga, who is the CEO of Docsum. Welcome.
Lovely. Thank you, Joan. Thanks for having us. Very, very excited about the opportunity to talk about this topic. And, what I'm really excited about is to get a little bit under the weeds. I think this has been a really interesting topic, and I'm joined by some wonderful panelists. We're going to just start with a quick round of introductions and then get into it. So, my name is Shaunik. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Docsum AI. We are a legal tech startup that was started in 2023, really at the boon and the beginning of all of these commercially available models. And our team is located in Manhattan. I'll pass it over to Stephen.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Brickley. I'm an advisor with the DocSum team. I actually come from a background on the customer-facing side of a number of privately owned software companies. So primarily focused on like sales and customer success. Recently, I led customer success for a traditional CLM provider called Syrian Labs or Syrian.ai, depending upon when you encountered them. And my primary focus there was helping clients actually implement their software, select additional components from the platform and so forth. So I help clients like Morgan Stanley and Amgen and Sherwin-Williams with their implementations and ultimately helping them really realize value from those implementations. So I come at this a little bit from a sales perspective and a little bit from a actual customer success and what's necessary to get value out of these platforms perspective. Catherine?
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm an attorney that has actually been in-house for about the past 10 years, serving in general counsel, chief legal officer roles, and I'm also a strategic advisor for Docsum. I come with a strong background in legal operations. I've led legal operations functions, procurement functions, and what I'll say is that I have selected and implemented probably way too many legal tech tools over the years, good, bad, ugly. So I'm here today to really share my experience and my insights that I've learned along the way. I'm going to pass it over to Karina.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karina Ketchatorian. I'm the K in KXT Law. As the managing partner of the firm, I've had to demo and evaluate many AI tools. And what I hope to bring to the panel today is just my experience in doing that. And I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for joining us.
Lovely. So, just to give a quick overview of DocSum and who we are and what we do, I mentioned we're in New York. We were backed by Y Combinator in 2023, and we really went out to on the mission to help in-house legal team members, navigate kind of the complexity of workflow related to both pre-signature and post-signature related tasks. There is already a quite entrenched market around contract lifecycle management. We started with very much a post-signature tool, our repository, and today we have a couple other components that we call our modular CLM. So we work with customers today that have no CLM. Maybe they just need, something basic to get up and running. We also work with customers that have much more complex architectures. And through this process, we've learned a lot about what it takes to build these platforms, really get these things to work really reliably, especially for legal workflows. And we're very much participating in the conversation, both with our customers, the market more broadly, and some of the foundational model providers that we'll be talking about today. So very excited about about where we are in this kind of time scale that is technology and everything that is coming forward. And so I'll dive a little bit more into Docsum and some of the portions that we solve for, but the talk today is not about Docsum at all. It's really about AI, but we'll share more information after the talk. So there's a lot that's happened, over the past couple of years. I kind of want to talk a little bit about my personal journey, and maybe that's something that y'all relate to as well. So the GPT-3 model, right, that was produced by OpenAI really came into commercial availability in November of 2022, maybe a little bit earlier for some folks, but largely it was in that time frame. And when I was living in San Francisco, it was incredibly exciting to be there at the time because we had finally a model that you could use that could semantically understand language. This was fantastic. This could do a lot of interesting things. And it kind of created this boom in San Francisco, but really globally with the introduction of ChatGPT, which was the application, right, that uses GPT-3 and now many other of the GPT series models. This was a tweet that was actually posted a year kind of after that journey, February 9th, where Sam Altman said that OpenAI was generating about 100 billion words per day. The second figure, I think it was a kind of a gross estimation, but what it was really indicating to me was the real impact of these systems, right? We're generating knowledge at a clip now that really was a spike upwards. And I'm sure if we see some of the metrics here today, they're quite a bit higher. And so, what I would like to kind of go through is talking a little bit more in depth about how these systems work and how legal tech vendors might actually use this technology to actually build a product. So, if we take a look at the progress so far, right? Tasks that are easy for humans tend to be easier for AI. I know that sounds, pretty obvious, but if we look somewhere on the left, we started with summarizing an email. The first version of Docsum that I ever wrote, sitting in a coffee shop in SF, was a tool that could take my email and summarize it into bullet points. And I was, leaping with joy, just seeing where that was. And today that just sounds like table stakes, right? So we were able to do more interesting work, like reviewing and redlining a contract in particular, against a rule set. And I think we're inching further and further with some of these architectures and capabilities to do more complex things. For example, the work of drafting new text. I'm sure you've all experienced, hey, draft me something very long if you're using AI. It's not the greatest at doing that, right? A lot of these models are not necessarily good at generating, new information in a format that we really care about. These are problems that some of the foundational model providers are solving for. And then there's this realm of kind of the unknown, right? So for example, things that are ambiguous, that require tasks and opinion, these are still things that we require humans to do. So interpreting maybe ambiguous regulations across many jurisdictions and using that to inform a strategy. Other non-legal examples might be solving open-ended scientific problems. For example, one thing that's very, very hard today in cancer therapy is detecting the recurrence of breast cancer. It is incredibly difficult. And, we have used classical approaches within machine learning to be able to use these factors, but just the number of facets and the data points that are both quantitative and qualitative that need to be consumed to be able to do this is just too large, right? And so there's huge opportunities there. Maybe things like making movies. I'm sure you've seen some of these Sora videos that have come out with AI generating videos, but it's not quite a full movie yet, right? And so there's still quite a bit away there. And this is kind of the trajectory that we might be on. So I like to start, really this presentation with what are the key takeaways? When we walk away, what are the things that you should remember? So the first thing is AGI is the goal. And I'm making the statement in that it's not the goal for me personally or whether I believe this, but it's truly the goal of the foundational model providers that are pioneering this technology. So OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, they are all after artificial general intelligence. There's no doubt about it. That is where the investment dollars are going. And what that really means is intelligence that's hard to discern from human intelligence. And they want to get to that singular goal. And large in part, tech vendors and individuals can benefit from that in some way. But those are the metrics and the heuristics that they're using to measure success. Number two, it's really, really important that LLMs are viewed as tools. This is very, very different than software, even from 5 or 10 years ago, where we would look at a piece of software or a tool and we would view it as a solution. I put something in, I get something out, and I'm going to measure that output. It's a little bit different here because, LLMs are kind of like a kitchen knife, right? You can use that knife to, ultimately prepare many different dishes in the kitchen. And I'll come back to a food reference later. But, it's really, really important that we understand that this is a tool for software developers to build things that drive specific outcomes within a platform. So maybe I want to accomplish something in Word or in email. And then a workflow. Maybe I want to accomplish this as a part of something that I'm doing, whether it's my team or something that's automated. The last bit here is really thinking about the rapid pace of this. I started with an example around getting excited about summarizing an email into bullet points. Look at where we are today with a lot of the capabilities, even with ChatGPT. This AI tooling offers, solutions to problems that we couldn't solve before. And I'm sure people are like, well, is it really saving me time? It's putting more work. Well, truly, if there's things that could be automated, then we could kind of spend our time doing other things. This is not just in the legal discipline. This is also very indicative of how we've come up to as a company. We're a very small team shipping software at a clip that once required many more humans and many more dollars of investment to actually come to fruition. But it's important to note that both the car and driver have impact on results, right? So you can be good at AI, just as you could have been good or bad at using Google to find information when Google came out. Okay. So what is generative AI? So, a good definition, I would say, is that generative AI refers to the set of artificial intelligence methodologies that can produce novel content that resembles the training data that they were exposed to. So this content can be anything, text, code, images, music, and more. But what's really important to understand is that it is mimicking something that appears to be correct because we've told it to be correct. So here's an example of a conversation between a user and an AI asking about advice on what to do when visiting a city. And you can see here that the AI is generating words in sequence and is using a predictive algorithm to determine what is the most likely next word. So it's important to note that this is not, a sentient AI that, like OpenAI has some kind of sentient being. It's really a very, very fast predictive model. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that how this actually works under the hood is that computers actually, these models don't actually read the words. They're interpreting these vector strings. So they're strings of, integers that represent both what the word is, but also more importantly, the relationship of the word with other words around it, which is a pretty kind of fuzzy concept. But if we go to the next slide, I'll show you a quick example of how that works. So an example here is these two phrases. the bank of the river, or money in the bank. In both of these phrases, the word bank appears differently and has a uniquely different meaning based on a reference point to another word in that phrase. So this is a simple illustration of how you could use vector math to be able to interpret what the word bank means in relation to river or to money. And so if we look at, it's something called an embedding. So these matrices of math are called embeddings, and embeddings are basically the language of these models, and you can use them to do really, really fast computations and predictions. So, the next couple slides here are going to be around how, this actually works in practice. So if you've watched iRobot or read kind of science fiction around AI, you can see second law of robotics: the robot must obey the orders given to it by its human beings. And so a process of and training an AI would be, let's take this phrase and remove certain things from that phrase and try to see whether or not the AI can predict whether or not what that word is supposed to be in that sequence. So the second law of robotics, A, robot must, right? And so these are things that get swapped in and out. So if we go to the next slide, we have a representation of how GPT-3 was actually trained. So it was a big data set of basically feeding a bunch of information into this model and then just getting the model to predict whatever it could. Originally, when GPT-2 came out, I remember some of the papers early on, it was able to finish, 3 words in a prediction. And that was revolutionary at the time. So to think that we can actually do the wealth of kind of predictions that we have at such a high clip is really, really, really cool. And so the next slide shows you actually something around how OpenAI has actually invested billions of dollars into the training of this. And this training ultimately is done through a mixture of humans. So humans that are looking at the predicted output to determine, what is the next word. So if you say a robot must exterminate, no, we have to correct that and say, actually, that's an error. It should say obey. And so we do this over a series of inputs. And, this is not something that us as the vendor is doing. So I want to make that clear. This is something that OpenAI and Anthropic are doing themselves to be able to ensure proper output. So the next slide here is ultimately what you get after tons of training, both through the AI participating in it as well as humans, is you get to some semblance of good outputs where you put an input prompt in and then you get an output. And then, Stephen, if you go to the next slide, just to give a map of kind of what this looks like, the building blocks of intelligence, or AGI, is, presently kind of threefold. One is language. So speech and text. I want to be able to understand and communicate language, both written and spoken. We have another modality, if we think about our brains, right? We have eyes. We have eyes and receptors that are actually taking that imagery and then processing it into data. That is, perception. So we have models like Stable Diffusion or Sora or Midjourney. The last frontier, which we are actually still breaching, is not quite yet, is a time series model. So how do we understand change and growth? And so these are things that we have, they're very much in their infancy, but the confluence of these 3 models working in conjunction together get us closer and closer to, some of those ideas around, having AI in the home. And, to be, very transparent, I think a lot of people in Silicon Valley believe that, the time horizons for a lot of these things are within the next 10 years. So I wanted to start with just breaking down also some lingo, because these are things that are used and thrown around, and I want to make sure that we have a good understanding for this. So prompt engineering. So what does that mean? So this is from the perspective of a vendor or an engineer using these foundational models. So when we say prompt engineering, we're carefully wording instructions on how the AI should handle inputs, data that we're giving it, and outputs. You've experienced prompting an AI to get an output. Vendors are doing this on our end and doing a lot of testing to make sure that prompts are working for specific workflows. And those are very unique to us and the models that we're using. Another term that you might hear is a RAG, so retrieval augmented generation. If you were to use ChatGPT today and try to upload 100 files, it won't work. It limits you to a certain number. The reason that is that it has to be able to parse that information and be able to hold it in context to give you a good output. RAG is a method of being able to feed maybe hundreds of documents. So in Docsum, our repository can hold for a customer maybe 50,000 or 100,000 agreements. And you might have a question. What is the indemnity provision in an agreement that we signed last quarter? The whole search space is quite large, but using a method like RAG and the tuning around that is a special kind of layer for us as a vendor to be able to deliver on that. You might have also heard things like fine tuning. So fine tuning specifically is where you are introducing the model with ideal input output pairs. I gave you this, you gave me back this, and that is ideally what I'm looking for. There has been a lot of focus early on when the models were really small, kind of GPT-3 and 4, where a lot of vendors were talking about fine tuning as being their prime differentiator. I will say that today that it is rare that you start with fine tuning. It's typically at a much higher clip, and it also finds that as these models have gotten better, that the dividends are not really there for fine tuning. So fine tuning, I don't think is necessarily a competitive advantage. If anything, it's viewed as something that's very costly and unnecessary for a vendor to maintain. Hallucination. So we talk about hallucination. What does that mean? Well, we talked about the fact that this is a predictive model. Well, math sometimes doesn't work in the right way, and the system will predict something in one way or the other. And so with Docsum, we do a lot of work under the hood to make sure that we're tracking when outputs deviate from what we accept. And so these hallucinations are real, they're expected behavior, and these are things that model providers are also working on. The last thing here is around tokens and context window. So these are two related topics where it relates to the way that a word is represented to that vector math effectively. And so there are limits to how much you can introduce. So for the state of the art models like GPT-5, actually GPT 4.1, Claude, they're all at 1 million tokens. So there's an actual limit to how much you could fit in one request. Okay, we're going to go to the next slide. And I would say that there's also a big, I won't spend too much time on this, but this will all be included kind of in the presentation afterwards. But, you probably heard the word agents, right? Gen AI agents is this thing agentic. It's floating around a ton. The frank reality is that all an agent is that it's a bunch of AIs. So think your ChatGPT instance calling other ChatGPT instances. And not only that, imagine this AI now, instead of just having the ability to chat, has arms and legs. It can access a computer. It can access a database. It can, go into your email. It can make choices. And so typically these agents are working to coordinate a plan for what it's going to do, accessing necessary tools, and returning it back. For most legal use cases that are supposed to be very, very auditable, predictive, measured, agentic AI is actually not necessarily the best tool for that type of problem space. So if you're thinking about a general kind of chatbot, so ChatGPT-5 or GPT-5 within ChatGPT is an agentic product, right? It's reasoning, it's planning out what it's going to do. But the problems with it is that it's really hard to observe how it's doing. So it's generally better to have, different types of architecture. So keep that in mind when you're going in market. Does this actually need to be an agent? How do I audit it? Those are questions you should be asking. So this is just a simple overview of kind of how a user might interact with an agent. The agent has access to a camera, text, audio, sensors, cognition, so it has memory, a database, and then the ability to make actions, right? And so each one of these things are capabilities that you're enabling to the agent itself. So I think one way to really think about this, and I'm a big foodie and I love cooking, is actually cacio e pepe. I made cacio. I actually have a really good cacio e pepe recipe that I'll include in the resources that I send out. But if you know this dish, cacio e pepe is really, really, really simple, right? It's pasta, cheese, pepper, salt, and water. I know in the image to the right, there's unsalted butter. I would never do that. But, it is very, very few amount of ingredients. And if you've ever tasted cacio e pepe, you know that it it wildly varies from place to place. And largely it's because not the ingredients themselves, which, that is important, but it's the technique of when you add the water, how you bring the cheese in, or what temperature you're bringing it at, that has a huge deviation in what the final output is. So when we actually think about Gen AI vendors that all kind of look the same, there is still quite a bit of deviation based on the ingredients that they're using and the way that they're preparing those ingredients. Everything from how they process a PDF that's coming in to the prompt engineering that they're putting into their prompts, how they're evaluating the outputs themselves, and how they're connecting to the software overall and kind of tuning the entire experience in that regard. So it's really, really important that, engineers or good engineering teams are thinking about all of this to get to good output. And then, we can go to the next slide, Stephen. I would say that this is a much more kind of practical way of thinking about, what are all of those components that, those ingredients that vendors are thinking about. So you probably have heard the term wrapper. This is just a wrapper. Well, that means that, for most products, we are all using, models that are either hosted by OpenAI or within a cloud infrastructure. And those base foundational models are, in fact, what provides inference. So OpenAI and Anthropic are providing all of these kind of key tools, but that's just an API. We still have to make a lot of choices around how that is going to be presented. So ChatGPT is a product. You can't wrap around ChatGPT because that's their proprietary product that they've engineered. The interface, the streaming, how the information comes back and forth. So in the same way, a legal vendor like a Docsum or anybody else is going to be thinking about these things. So we have tools. How does it access the web? How does it handle memory? In our case, we've built specific tooling for handling docx files, which is unique to how we actually process the information. We do a lot of things around prompting. We've also built and engineered our whole evaluation stack, right? We have to know whether or not these outputs are good or not. How do we know whether they're deviating from what we expect to be true? And then there's pure software. How good and does your product look and feel? There's UI, UX considerations, integrations, infrastructure, monitoring, security. So there are many different facets that are going to make drastic impacts on ultimately output cost, speed, and quality. And any choice that you make in any part of these knobs that you turn will have trade-offs and outcomes that impact any three of those dimensions. So, I'll leave this in here and you'll look at, kind of, I hope you take a look at this afterwards, but there's a really big difference between good and great. And I think the teams that I'm seeing, that I'm interacting with, both through Y Combinator, through, the industry developers, they're all thinking about quality. How do we measure quality? Because it's very, very challenging to do so because what you're measuring on is often not quantitative. Right? If I take a look at something and I say, hey, is this value 0 or 1? It's very point blank whether or not there's quality. But how do you measure the quality of, a red line that has been generated? On what basis are you actually doing that? And that's not necessarily even a technical question. That's a how we do work kind of question, right? How do we actually measure the quality of quality legal work? And so I will say that this is a question that you should be thinking about yourselves in your particular practice area. How do you measure good, right? Not just process, but actual work output. And then, working with vendors to be able to make sure that those heuristics are something that's included as part of the evaluation. So that's it for the technical bit. I'm going to pass it over to Katie. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, let's talk about the vendor landscape. Just to address the elephant in the room, it's kind of a scary place right now. Shaunak covered ways to differentiate between AI tools, but how do we even begin when there's just so many vendors on the market? If you're like me, you're probably receiving a message on LinkedIn every single day. It's a new vendor from a company you haven't heard from before, haven't heard about before. Some have good names, some might have bad names. There's just a lot on the market. But I think what we're seeing is that everyone's claiming to just solve all of the problems that you have, all of the legal tech problems. And the gap is really widening between those marketing promises versus the actual capabilities. I know I've seen this over the past few years. So going back to Shaunak's cacio e pepe analogy, how do we determine who makes the best cacio e pepe when everyone's using the same ingredients? And really the short answer to that is that you have to taste the dish. The long answer is that you need some sort of selection framework. And Karina and I have put together a selection framework that you can use, but also feel free to add to it. So Steve, if you want to go to the next slide. This is an easy one out of the gate. It seems easy. It's actually a little bit more complicated, but you need to start with the actual problem. I think as lawyers, we often tend to, I would say, be overachievers. We like to set lofty goals for ourselves. We like to try to solve the future state. We like to try to solve risk proactively. And that can lead us to thinking through everything that we need to do in the future versus actually solving the problem that we have today. I would say about 10 years ago when I was implementing one of my first CLM tools, I was very focused on everything that I'd be able to do with that tool versus thinking through what I needed to solve for. I was in a position where I had hundreds of contracts to continually review and report up to the leadership team. I was in a PE-backed company, and there was constant reporting going on. And what I found is that I was having trouble continually going through those contracts, data extracting with accuracy, and getting those reports up to the leadership team. And I selected a tool that was really great. It had a lot of bells and whistles, but it actually didn't do that task well for me. And that was a miss on my part. And so what I tell people is always go back to the problem that you need to deal with today to determine what needs to be on your short list in terms of vendors. And then you can group those vendors by the problem solved. The third one on this list is probably one of the most important. It's free trials and pilots are absolute gold. I actually do not go with companies that do not offer these. And it's really because I feel that the company may not be confident in their product if they don't offer them, or alternatively, it could be because the implementation is very complex. Either of those for the industry that I'm in and typically the size of company that I'm in don't work well for me. They may for others, but they don't for me. And so if I get down to narrowing down on my list and they say no proof of concept, no free trial, at that point, I'm probably going to throw that vendor out. The thing about proof of concepts and trials, definitely use your own data, own templates, test it with their own data and templates, because if they have pre-configured templates or data, you're not going to see the best results or the results that you would have on a day-to-day basis if you were to implement that tool. Evaluate and compare by quality of output. Could not emphasize this enough. Compare the results side by side with other vendors. If you're analyzing multiple vendors, maybe a ChatGPT versus another purpose-built legal AI tool, test with prompts. Test with prompts, see what the outputs are, see what the variations are, make sure the prompt is the same to see what you get from each tool, and add trap examples. All of you probably have some specialty area on this call. You're going to know certain areas of law better than others. Those are the types of examples that you might want to throw into the system to see, what type of results am I going to get? Does it come back with the correct answer and good information? And then if you're implementing like a CLM tool or a data extraction tool, test with some messy, more ambiguous examples. Maybe it's the document that was scanned and has like the handwritten notes on the side, and see what happens when you throw that into your data set. And then number 5 here is measuring precision, recall, and error rate. There's a little bit of math behind this, and I'm actually going to include a slide when I send all of this out that has the math, so you can go through and actually do this on your own. But the idea is that you would have a data set, 50 contracts, that you are able to go through and measure precision, recall, and error rate. And you do this by looking at each vendor, and you also want to have a blind evaluation. So at the end, when you're comparing results, make sure that you've assigned somebody, not yourself, to review those results and they don't know which vendor it's associated with. Check references, always check references, not just the vendor references, but check references through your own networks, and also check references that are similar to your stage and company size, because then you're going to get a really good idea of how that vendor is done with implementation for the particular size of company that you might be in. And you'll be able to understand a little bit more if you go and you check the references too from other networks. You can rely on the vendor references as well, but it's always good to kind of reach outside and get as many references and recommendations. And then just start small, prove and expand. It doesn't have to be you start with everything. You can start with a small data set, like 50 NDAs. You can then measure using the math that I'm going to provide you later with the precision, recall, and error rate. And then you expand from there. You can add more contracts in later, but you can take it piece by piece. And that's oftentimes a good way to go in these situations, when especially it's your first one. So Karina, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thanks, Katie. I'm speaking on behalf of my own personal journey with AI. It started about a year and a half ago. As a managing partner and co-founder of KXT Law, I felt like I really needed to understand the AI landscape so that our firm wouldn't be left behind. And the checklist that I've put together is just a summary of sort of the high points of my journey. I would really encourage everyone who's attending not to embrace AI and don't think you can't learn it. Literally a year and a half ago, I didn't even think AI was going to impact my work experience. But I pushed myself to learn. And the things that really stood out to me was, and my process was, I would ask around and see what people were using in my circle. And then I would demo the tools to see whether I thought they were good or solved a problem, as Katie was talking about. Then if I thought it was something that could address some of the issues that we were going over, I actually would ask for their contract or license agreement. Because before I would ask for a free trial and fall in love with something, I wanted to see if there were any issues that would just be deal breakers for me. I would also ask for, if they are using LLMs, their contracts with the LLM so that I could confirm that there was no data training. I could confirm where our data was going to be stored. I could confirm that it wasn't going to be stored offshore. I could confirm that, who owned the data. And on top of that, it was also really important that in terms of indemnification, that was something that really came up for me. Some you'll see on these vendor agreements, they vary very wildly in terms of indemnification. And the one flag for me was if I had to indemnify the vendor, that was something that just as a practice, I don't do at KXT Law, at least without limits. So that's just something to think about. And size in this instance will also dictate some of this. We are a boutique law firm. So if Apple were, for example, engaging some of these vendors, indemnification may be a different issue for them than it would be for us, for example, or smaller legal departments. But the 9 items that are on this slide is really the things that came up when we were demoing, doing free trials. And the last thing I would say before I turn it back is one of the other things I've just done for verification is when I've been having free trials of some of these tools before we decide to subscribe. If I was able to, I would do tests internally where I would prompt the certain issue or problem that I was using the vendor platform for. And then I would go to either Gemini or ChatGPT or Anthropic, and I would put in the same queries and compare the output to sort of evaluate what I was really getting if I was going to subscribe. Are the answers better? Are they worse? Are they easier to use? And then finally, I got buy-in from everyone at our firm, which I think is probably easier for us because we're on the smaller side, but it has to be usable for everyone. Otherwise, some of the capability and some of the reasons for which you're subscribing may not be 100%. So that's what I've learned over the course of a year and a half, and I hope that if other people have come across things that they want to share, I hope you'll put it in the chat, and I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks. I wanted to give a little bit of perspective on selecting products like this and their implementation, maybe from the context, like I mentioned, of having seen a lot of implementation projects around legal AI and just technology in general, particularly in large organizations. But I think a lot of these things apply even more so for smaller organizations. And the first would be, don't boil the ocean. I think Shamik mentioned, maybe Catherine mentioned, that a lot of the vendors are going to claim to cover essentially every potential use case within the space, within the legal tech space. And they're naturally incented to try and build as big of a business case model as possible, as broad of an implementation as possible within your organization in order to capture the largest price for their software, right? That's naturally what they do. But as the scope and the size and all the different types of problems you may be trying to solve expand, the risk around that implementation goes up non-linearly, right? So if you've got 7 different departments involved and we're covering everything from contracts to legal research, that's a much bigger problem and much riskier proposition to try and get it done than just taking those incrementally as small pieces. So I'd say, be diligent about identifying a very specific problem that you're trying to solve initially, solve that problem, and then increase the scope of the solution, expand the implementation, and so forth to take on additional challenges. So it's very much kind of what Katie, you said, start small, prove, then expand. It's a classic kind of agile incremental approach, and I think it's especially relevant here with a very rapidly changing market and a lot of relatively new tools vendors out there. So also, I think both Katie and Karina mentioned try before you buy. You definitely want to get your hands on the product and experiment with it, but in a little bit more of a structured sense before you commit to implementing and signing a contract. For a lot of software companies, standing up that kind of a trial environment is a non-trivial exercise. So, Katie kind of alluded to, well, maybe it's not quite ready and they don't want to let you see it. That could be it. But it could also simply be that it's just very time-consuming and expensive behind the scenes for them to stand up that environment for you. That in and of itself is not necessarily an issue, but it does indicate that, it's probably a pretty good indicator of how difficult it's going to be for you to stand it up in your real-world implementation as well. So if there's no opportunity to kind of try and exercise the product in advance, could be indicative that maybe it's not quite baked, but it also could be indicative that it's just going to be a really heavy lift to actually implement it and get value. One other note, I think it was Katie that mentioned this. When you are trialing it, really focus the evaluation on your use cases, how you intend to use it from a business process and an actual functionality perspective. Less so maybe looking at the comparative features lists that they are like promoting and which one does which feature better. What you really want to do is determine which is the best vendor for you and the problem that you're trying to solve, as opposed to just sort of a general market survey of who's the better quote unquote vendor in general. And then also, when you do the trial, when you do your proof of concept, I think a lot of folks essentially will work with a vendor to get the environment set up and then set their team loose and themselves loose in it and just experiment. And typically, you get a better outcome if you have a very specific set of things that you're evaluating, tests that you're going to run, target accuracy and expectations, and actually work towards clicking through those things and confirming them in the context of the trial. Less of a sort of, there is an element of like, am I comfortable with this? Do I like the UI? And am I comfortable navigating in the product and so on? But just sort of kicking the tires doesn't necessarily lead to a real conclusive decision on what the best option is going to be. Last one, again, all of our data, super important, particularly in the space that we're in. You know, and I think this was a little bit mentioned by Corinna, but you know, so as a software company, we're valued partially on our customer retention. Therefore, we don't try to build like really easy to use off ramps, right? If you decide to change your mind down the line, most software companies are not going to spend a lot of time and engineering dollars on making it easy for you to leave the platform. I would say, during that initial conversation, during the trial, et cetera, during the contracting process, really test the vendor's commitment to data portability. And it's not just their sort of contractual willingness to state that you can get your data back and so forth, but also have it demonstrated technically. Make sure that it's actually there's a practical way to actually get that data back out that you've put in. They may say, we're totally cool with helping you with that. But when you actually get to that situation, it's like, well, it's going to be 4 months for us to engineer a solution that's going to allow you to get the data out. Willingness, but not capability, doesn't necessarily help the situation. So those are, from a high level, a couple of key things that I would definitely consider as you do the selection and implementation of these types of products. So wanted to do two things here. One was, first of all, give you a couple of links and resources and so forth. Shauna, can you talk a little bit about the free workshop coming up?
Absolutely. So, this was just the start. Transparently, I really want to work with as many people as possible, and teach them about AI and get them excited and start building things. I think that's how we create new knowledge. And so, this is the first of many, but this is going to be a workshop that I'm holding on November the 20th at 3 p.m. Eastern. There's the link. It's a Loom event. What we're going to do is it's going to be a no code workshop where you're going to learn to go actually build something. So we're going to actually build something together, build our own agent. So that's going to be pretty fun. So definitely come through, bring a friend. And we'll be holding more of these. And so if you have additional questions, if you're thinking about a particular problem, if you're trying to figure out how to navigate something, I'm happy to be a resource. On the resources side here, created this link here, which will also host all of the let's see here, yeah. So this is the resources that I've kind of aggregated, really good articles worth reading. This AI 2027 article, highly recommend checking this out. It is a really good walkthrough of what is going to happen in the near term with these foundational model providers. It talks about a little bit about geopolitics and the economy as they're playing out. I think it's very, very interesting. I've also linked Karina's. Karina, do you want to talk about this a little bit? Some of the publication work with Law 360.
Oh, sure. So we have a column with Law 360, the augmented lawyer. It's a monthly column where we try to shed some light on hot topics on legal tech and practice in lawyers' everyday lives. We're on our third series is going to get published, I think, in the next week or so.
Great. Lovely. And then I've included some other papers here. This paper, Attention is All You Need, is the basis for the transformer architecture that actually created GPT. If you have questions about how this actually came through, this is some really fun nighttime reading. And then if we go down the list here, we also have some great videos that I've included. There's some that are more recent that are from Stanford's AI Club. Very interesting. Here's another view of specifically how LLMs work in more depth. I think it's worth taking a look at that. And Andrew Wen also does some really great work and coursework with Coursera on this topic. So this link will have all of the resources. I'll continue to add to it, and then it'll also have the meeting notes post this call, including a link to the recording. So all of that will be captured in that singular instance if you want to go ahead and save that. But from there, would love to connect with all of you on LinkedIn and get your feedback and participate in the conversation in any way. Wanted to open it up for questions from the audience.
And Shaunak, I did see a question in the chat. Would you look to hold a workshop or session for an internal team?
Absolutely. Yeah, we've definitely done that before. Happy to touch base on that. Just feel free to reach out to me via email, shaunik@docsum.ai, and happy to coordinate on next steps for that. And for folks that want to ask a question, we encourage you to come off mic. If you're comfortable, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself. I'm happy to bring you in. There's a question for you, Karina, in the
I
chat.
see that. They gave it to me every time. So the question is wondering how often you were able to get the underlying LLM contracts from vendors. In uh, my own journey in demoing and these types of tools, they've given them to me. Interestingly, I also advise on AI contracts. And in one of those instances, the vendor would not give us the contract with the LLMs. They made representations and warranties about what the contract said, but they wouldn't give us the contract. So for my firm, I've gotten the contract every time. One time when I was helping a client, we weren't able to get it.
I think there's a question from Tarek. Olivia, could you open the mic?
Yes, hi. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you all so much for the presentation. Super helpful. I'm a big law attorney practicing in New York. And I had a question for Shaunak. I found the explanation of how an LLM's output works very useful, especially the sort of visual representation. And I was wondering how it interprets the input. Is it a similar sort of process but in reverse? Just because prompt engineering is extremely useful, and I find that when I speak to attorneys who don't really understand why we even bother using AI, it's because their prompt engineering isn't very good yet. So I'm just wondering, like in a sort of basic technical level, like how is a model generally interpreting my input?
Yeah, yeah. You know, let me think about a good analogy here. So we all can buy gas to fill it in our car, right? We all own maybe different models of cars. Cars are different, but generally speaking, unleaded petroleum is going to combust at a certain temperature and clip that is going to work in an engine. But the process of actually refining that oil can vary depending on where you're pulling it from. And that process of refinement is something that the vendor needs to handle. So for us, for example, if you give us 10 documents, not only are we parsing through it, we have to do OCR, handwriting detection, figuring out the underlying language, but we also have to do a process called embedding, which is basically using math to create those vector representations. So those embeddings are generated by a model, and that's a whole other set of models that we actually didn't cover. Embedding models there's many out there. You can use, for example, OpenAI actually has an embedding model that they use, and there's certain characteristics of the math that it generates that works really well with their underlying model. So if you embed, for example, a piece of text using OpenAI's embedding model, but then and a client then says, "Hey, I actually want to use Claude," there can be some loss, just as like a lock and a key, where the embedding math doesn't actually math perfectly with when you actually bring it into the LLM when you're asking a question. So the actual input that you're putting in is translated into some vector, and then there is a process of comparing, the input and the output together through math to actually get the generated output. And there's also other considerations when you're doing larger document sets of how you handle that. But does that help answer your question, Tarek?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I love Ali's takeaways from the meeting. Cacio e Pepe being the top meeting note from the AI. So I like that that stuck with the AI. Perfect. Um, one thing I do want to kind of share as well on that topic is, there are a number of companies and startups that have come and gone since the start of all of this. And a lot of that has been predicated on, various different things, but in particular, there are some companies that have really focused around what are the shortcomings of the model today. So I mentioned, for example, long form writing and drafting being a challenge of these models. So there's probably vendors that have built other kind of models or methodologies to really handle that. To me, as an engineer, those are some of the things that I tend to shy away from as being something that where we optimize because it's ultimately a confluence of these foundational model providers delivering on that, which will end up kind of being solved. What won't be solved is things that are specific to a workflow. So in the legal domain, if you're thinking about a particular document type, a workflow, interface, the way you do work, approvals, those are the kind of things that are going to be very specialized within an area of practice or a user group that won't be covered. It's the same way where, way back when, people were building plugins in Microsoft Word that were non-AI. And, venture capitalists were like, well, what would prevent, Microsoft Word from just building that? The short answer is that, even how big the legal domain is, it's far too small for, a Microsoft to really over specialize their tool for a single domain. They generally try to keep things as generic as possible for as many use cases and work with vendors to kind of build that specialization in.
Well, we had a question in the chat. Will a link to the recording be made available? Yes. Olivia will send that out to all of the registrants after the session is over. And if we don't have any more questions, last chance to ask a question. Otherwise, we'll give everybody, let's see, 3 minutes back in their day and wrap up the session. And thank you to all of our speakers. This was fantastic, really informative and so appreciated. And I see the clapping coming in from the audience. So very well done to the Docsum team, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for hosting this. And yeah, we hope to continue to just keep the conversation going. So definitely reach out. Thank you so much.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.